Check, check, mic check. Check, check, mic check. Welcome to Podcast Envy. I'm your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder, and this is episode number 36 with Julie Neale of Mother's Quest. And this is part of our podcasting and social impact. I was going to say podcasting and social media. This is part of our podcasting and social impact series. And you may think, well, how does a podcast about being a mom have a social impact? What does that have to do with social justice and change? Well, in Julie's case, everything. So one thing that I learned about Julie very early on when I first met her at Podcast Movement, the biggest conference of the year for podcasters, was that Julie is not just a mom. Her mission is all about creating a meaningful life for herself, parallel to and integrated with her identity as a mom. And part of that mission has become a strong focus on social justice issues, which really affect all of us in ways that sometimes we don't even realize. So Julie started an initiative called Women Podcasters in Solidarity, and it is a huge effort that she is putting behind this project whereby women podcasters, so that's any of you listening right now who identify as a woman, committing to release in a certain time period one episode around a particular social justice topic. And so the first round was focused on racism and Black Lives Matter. And the current round that we are in right now is about gun violence. And not only that, Women Podcasters in Solidarity also has a secondary objective, which is for the podcasters to encourage listeners to contribute to an organization or a cause or a fund that directly supports efforts to work with these institutional problems that we have in society. So yes, this episode is for moms, but it's not just for moms. It's for anybody who wants to learn how to use the power of podcasting to make a profound difference in the world. No small feat, right? I have so much gratitude for the work that Julie is doing and for the interview that you're about to hear. But before we get there, I just want to invite you to participate in a little gratitude experiment that I'm running and an opportunity for you to be featured here on Podcast Envy in December. I've started a hashtag on Instagram, podcast gratitude. And there isn't a whole lot there right now at this moment, but that's because I want you to fill it up. So I would love for you to post visual representations, images, videos, text, whatever you want to post on Instagram about why you are grateful for podcasts, either as a listener and consumer of podcasts or as a podcast maker and producer, or both. Use the hashtag podcastgratitude and tag me at Andrea Klunder so that I see it. Additionally, beyond that, if you would like to be featured on a December episode of Podcast Envy, I want you to talk to me. Send me a 3-minute or less recording telling a story about why you're grateful for podcasts, how they've changed your life, how creating a podcast has made a difference in your world. Be sure to include your name and, if you have one, your show, and send it over to me. The best way to share your file is via Dropbox or Google Drive, and you can use the email address andrea@infuselife.net. Again, that's Dropbox or Google Drive. The email address is andrea@infuselife.net, and I will put links and instructions in the show notes for this episode, which you can find in the description section of your app, and at thecreativeimpaster.com/podenvy036 for episode 36. Oh, the deadline for audio files is November 20, 2018. And for Instagram posts, go ahead and post stuff through the end of the year, or keep going beyond then. I can't wait to hear what you have to say and to see what you post on Instagram. Again, that's hashtag podcast gratitude. All right. With my hands in a namaste, prayer, gratitude, thank you position, I'm happy to share with you my conversation with Julie Neale of Mother's Quest. Julie Neale, thank you so much for joining me on Podcast Envy.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm really excited to have this time with you. It's been a while since we've been able to connect.
I know. We met now over a year ago at Podcast Movement when it was in Anaheim, right?
That's right. Yeah. And you became a fast friend of mine, and we had a wonderful evening together, connecting and talking with other podcasters. And then you ended up being one of the first people to say yes to the first season of the Women Podcasters in Solidarity initiative, which I know we'll talk more about. And I've really appreciated being in connection and community with you.
Yeah. So when we met at that podcast movement, how long had you been podcasting at that point?
It was still my first year. So I launched the podcast in December of 2016. And I think I had been podcasting maybe for about 6 months or so.
Yeah, that's super new. That's like a little baby podcaster at Podcast Movement. And then from there, what you have created since that time has been amazing. It's really blown my mind what you've been able to accomplish through your show and through your podcasting connections in such a short period of time. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, tell us a little bit about your show, Mother's Quest.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for that reflection back. I really appreciate that. So Mother's Quest is what I call my for-purpose venture that really extends beyond the podcast itself. And the mission behind it is to support myself and other mothers to live what I call an epic life. And this really came from my own quest as a mother to figure out how I could be engaged and present in my children's life, but also not forget about living my own life. So I committed, now it'll be more like about 3 years ago, to this vision I had to more fully claim my own life while still being a great mom, and believing that actually the more I stepped into living my own life, the more powerful mother I could be, and wanting to build a community and a network of support for myself and other moms. And so the podcast was really the first part of a much bigger vision I have for Mother's Quest that I wanted to start with, because I felt like as I was venturing into this different way of living and creating a venture and becoming a business owner for the first time, I didn't want to feel like I had to figure it out all by myself. So the premise of the podcast is that I am looking all the time for guides, other women and mothers who are on a similar path and maybe have learned some lessons a little bit ahead of me, that I can bring onto the podcast and be in conversation with and have them shine some light for myself, but also everyone else who's listening. And another thing that I do is I invite each of them to give me a challenge at the end of every episode.
Ooh, this is one of my favorite things about your show.
I love it too. In full disclosure, I will admit that some of the challenges I have not implemented as fully as others, and some I come back to at different points. But I do, for the most part, take it all very seriously. And so those challenges have also been a really key part of how my own life has deepened and become more meaningful as I've been on this path.
Yeah, I actually just taught a workshop about podcasting, as I do frequently here in Chicago. And I was giving examples of different creative ways to think about content and community building and calls to action around your show. And I used your show, actually, I didn't even tell you this. I used your show as an example of an interesting way to use your call to action to build community. Because I think that as podcasters, we often think of the call to action as like a marketing plug, or sign up for my email list, or subscribe to the show, or leave me a rating and review. And that's so boring. And what you have really done is made this opportunity for your guests to give you a challenge, and then also to extend that challenge out to your audience and on your blog, in your show notes. And it creates sort of this way that we can interact through your show, even though sometimes we don't know who our listeners are, or sometimes we don't know where they are, or they're all spread out. Can you give an example of one of the challenges that has been really interesting or challenging for you?
Yes. Well, another key part of Mother's Quest is my Facebook community,
Mm-hmm.
which, started out as like a few friends and family, and now we're almost at about 600 people in that group. So a lot of the challenges and also my reflections on what's happening and kind of my reporting back and helping to hold myself accountable take place within the private Facebook group. So one example of a challenge that ended up moving into something meaningful and much longer lasting was one that I co-created with a guest on my podcast. Lindsay McCarthy is the author of The Miracle Morning for Parents and Families. And I really was looking for her help initially the first time around to help me create a more intentional morning practice. And so we decided as an extension of that interview, and actually, if you tune into this one, we actually created it in our conversation on the podcast. We kind of came up with this idea together that I would love to have her support. And then I realized, oh, maybe other members of my community would like to do it. So we committed to this 30-day challenge. She offered daily prompts for us in the Facebook group. And then I committed to daily reflections. And it was really beautiful. And a lot of people came along, both from my community and hers. And then just this fall, I actually circled back again to her. So I have two boys, 6 and 14, and they both had really big school milestones this year, one going to kindergarten and one starting high school. So I wanted to reconnect with Lindsay and see if she could help me not only reinvigorate my morning practice, but see about how I might transfer a morning practice to my children. And so we did a shorter challenge this time around with more of an emphasis on how we bring the practices to our kids. And that was also really helpful and landed in a pretty powerful way for my kindergartner, who really is using those practices in the morning before he goes to school. So that's just one example, but recently released my 50th episode. So there are so many different ways. Sometimes it's more about just something to be aware of, more of a mindfulness practice. Sometimes it's a really specific action. Another one I'm thinking of, I interviewed Samantha Edis, who's the author of The Pie Life, for my podcast. And in our conversation there, we started to talk about community connections and how around the Jewish high holidays, because I'm no longer with my family in Los Angeles, I tend to feel unanchored and I don't know where to go, like for Break the Fast, for Yom Kippur. And she challenged me to host my own Break the Fast and to realize that I also don't only need to invite people from my community who are Jewish. And so as a result of that, I hosted my first Break the Fast 2 years ago, and it was a great success. And I was able to, take photos and then share in my community about that event. And then I just had my second one. So now it's become an annual tradition for me and has really changed the way I feel about that holiday. And I'll give one last example because it's the most current. I had Nika Smith on for my 50th episode, on an episode about genealogy and becoming our own family historians. And so her challenge to me was to start to register at ancestry.com and to start to uncover my family history and to also look for connections from my ancestors that relate to who I am and what I'm doing today. So my life just is enriched in so many meaningful and surprising ways through these conversations.
I think that's so cool to think of how looking at the value of your podcast for you, the podcaster, not only just in terms of using it to get a following or get more clients or promote your work, but also what can happen when you think of it more as a conversation and an opportunity to connect with someone else from whom you could learn a lot, and not just like, oh, I'm having this interview for the benefit of my audience, but you're actually enriching yourself too through these conversations.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, in my podcast opening, I'm really upfront about it. I say that I created the podcast for myself. I launched it on December 1st, which was my 45th birthday. It was a big milestone birthday. And I just invite people to come along. I trust that, if these conversations and challenges are meaningful for me, that they're also going to resonate with other people.
And so, as if Mother's Quest podcast was not already making a profound positive impact in people's lives, you actually decided to take it a step further in the podcasting community and create something called Women Podcasters in Solidarity. And that was something that I collaborated with you on in the first go around of that idea when you were still kind of trying to figure out how does this work, who is going to be a part of it. And now I owe you information for the current round. Tell us, what is Women Podcasters in Solidarity and how did that come to be?
So one of the things that I have been on a quest for is how to step into more responsibility, more action, more activism in my own life. And specifically through the podcast, how to use my voice and this amazing platform to make a difference and to shine the light on conversations around issues of social justice that honestly I was not having with the same level of bravery before. So I had an experience that was really profound through a friend of mine, Genji Heiston, and sort of the pathway of all of this can be traced through various episodes on the podcast. But she, after, many Black men had been killed by police officers, she had shared this powerful, vulnerable Facebook Live about how it felt for her to literally fear for the safety of her Black husband and her Black sons and Black brother on a regular basis when they go out the door each day. And it really struck me. And I reached out to her, and that began a conversation. Around the same time, I also had been just so upset about a video I saw of Diamond Reynolds, who was Philando Castile's girlfriend, and her 4-year-old daughter. There was some video coverage of them in the back of the cop car after Philando Castile had been killed. And this little girl, who at the time was the same age as my youngest son, telling her mom not to yell and, I don't want anything to happen to you and I'll protect you. And it was just so heartbreaking. And so the combination of the conversation I had been in with Genji and then what I witnessed, I just couldn't not do anything anymore. And I didn't know what I could do, but I felt like I could at least start to ask some questions and be in conversation. And so I committed to doing a series of podcast episodes on the issues of anti-racism and police brutality. And what really sealed this was the Charlottesville rally happened around the time that I had been thinking about doing this. And so that day was the day I kind of put my stake in the ground and said, I'm not going to wait for perfection. I'm not going to wait till I suddenly feel like I've arrived at being able to have these kind of conversations. I'm just going to commit to doing it. And I realized that if I could make that commitment, that I could invite other women podcasters whose voices I feel like are so needed to make a similar commitment. And then the Women Podcasters in Solidarity initiative was born. And I envisioned it. I was really clear about the first season, but I also felt like I think this is something we should commit to over time. So the first season ended and was very powerful, and you and a total of 12 other people contributed, and all of those episodes are available for people to listen to at womenpodcastersinsolidarity.com. And then this time around, I felt like we should do another season and polled the group, and we landed on the subject of gun safety, gun violence, which in some ways was a natural extension of the first topic, but also covers a lot of other potential conversations that we could be having.
That's so relevant for me living in Chicago, where the media is very happy to constantly report on the gun violence problem in Chicago. And it is a problem. Chicago is a very segregated city. And being a North Sider, quote unquote, I don't see a lot of that. And it's easy to forget what a big problem it is. But I work with high school students who primarily are South Siders, and they have a very different reality than what I experience. And there are, young people growing up in a very different reality than what I experience. And I just had a student the other day, we were doing a podcasting exercise where we were brainstorming ideas for personal stories that we could tell, personal narrative. And she was telling a story about remembering when she was younger and her sister and her mom threw a surprise birthday party for her. And it was such a great day and it was such a happy memory. And the story was happy about this surprise party because the prompt had been, tell us a story about a time when you were surprised. And she was like, I remember this day because it was fall and it was a little bit cooler outside and there were autumn leaves. And then at the very end, she said, that was such a great time because we used to be able to play outside and now we don't because it's not safe.
Wow.
And I was just like, whoa, here was this beautiful, like, happy memory. And then the very end of it is the harsh reality of what her world feels like right now. And I just was like, this is, it's a lot to handle.
Yeah. And I'm really grateful because you did tell me that you have a series of conversations that you've done with your students on the subject.
Mm-hmm.
And I am really hoping that you're going to contribute that. I think it's so important to hear from young people's perspective, and the work that you're doing with them is really incredible. And, the whole issue of gun safety, we often think of this as, something that is mostly focused on the issue of these horrible mass shootings that are happening and the need for gun control. But when I interviewed, I've already done one of the series that I'm going to be contributing with Gloria Pan, who is the head of gun safety for Moms Rising, an incredible advocacy organization. And she's really clear in our conversation that gun safety issues disproportionately impact communities of color, and that police violence is also a form of gun violence that we need to name as such.
You know that Chicago just had a huge verdict.
I saw that. Really groundbreaking.
It was so intense. The day that the jury was deliberating on this is the Laquan McDonald case in which it was a teenager who was killed. He was shot, I believe, 16 times by a police officer in the back. He was walking away. He was armed with a small knife. And it was controversial in a lot of different ways. One, because there was a dash cam video that was suppressed originally and then later released. And the video, what it looks like is that the police officer arrived on the scene, immediately got out of the car, and immediately started shooting. And so this happened in, I believe, 2014. And they've been awaiting trial this entire time. And so the jury was deliberating on this. And it was so intense that day that we were expecting a verdict that universities were telling professors to cancel classes.
Wow.
I received an email from the nonprofit organization that I do my high school program through with instructions and resources about how to talk with your students about this issue and how to support them. There were activists who were calling for strong actions to be taken in protest if the jury did not come back with a murder verdict. So it was like we didn't really know what was going to happen. And they came back with a verdict of second-degree murder. And that's like very unusual. And also multiple counts of, I believe, aggravated battery is the correct charge.
Yeah, for every single shot.
Right. And it's a huge conversation. And I know that here it's a much bigger problem than I ever imagined.
Yeah, I mean, because I've been becoming more and more involved in this issue of police brutality and then moving towards police accountability, I was following that story closely. And I've become in connection with some mothers who have lost loved ones to police brutality. And I know this verdict really made a big difference to feel like maybe things are beginning to change. And in the state of California, where I live, we just had the passage of a really important piece of legislation, SB 1421, which now makes it possible for the public to access records about police officers who have had a history of misconduct. Previously, that information was not made available. So I think we're starting to see some changes, but there's still so much more work to be done.
And so how do you think that podcasting, there's so many problems in the world and there's so many potential ways to make a social impact or to make positive change. What do you think it is about podcasting, or what is the potential for podcasting for making those kinds of changes and influences?
I think there is something really amazing and unique about the intimacy of a podcast conversation. that you really can feel like you're right there with someone in bringing on, people like Sarah Mercuria, who's the co-founder of Mothers Against Police Brutality, who I had a conversation with in that first season of the initiative, for her to share her story of being a child who witnessed her father being killed by a police officer and how that has fueled her passion to make a difference and what she feels like is the pathway forward and how we can support her and her organization. I think that it just connects you to people where there might be a bigger divide in a way that is unusual. And I mean, I know for me, being able to actually reach out to people that I would never ordinarily be able to do and have them say yes to a conversation is also incredibly unique. I'm hoping it's going to happen. At the moment, I'm preparing to interview Sabrina Fulton, Trayvon Martin's mom, on Friday for one of my contributions for the initiative this season. And I'm certain that there will be a lot of people in my community that may have the opportunity to hear from Sabrina who haven't had as much exposure and who certainly won't have heard her be able to share in such a deep and intimate way. And I think when we are able to really listen to people and their stories and their lessons, we're moved in powerful ways. I think the power of real conversation and dialogue that's not superficial but in depth can be really transformative.
Oh, it's podcast angel time. I think I'm going to sing a new song every single episode. Maybe. We'll see. All right, this week's podcast angel is me. I want to hang out with you in 2019. I want to get to know you. I want to support you. I want your show to either exist if you haven't launched yet, or to become more and more and more amazing if you are already producing a show. Because I know I have a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B here in this community. I am offering 2 custom VIP support groups for aspiring podcasts who want to launch. That is the Podcast Envy Launch Pod, details for which can be found at thecreativeimposter.com/launchpodenvy, and linked in the show notes, of course. And the VIP circle for current podcasters who want to take it to the next level, who want to stop feeling so isolated in your closet or your home office or wherever it is that you're recording your podcast. And that can be found at thecreativeimposter.com/grow together. And I know I've been super vague about the details of these programs, especially the VIP circle. And the reason why is because I don't like to plan a lot of content for I don't know who. So I'm creating this program much in the same way that I create my mentorship program that I run with high school students here in Chicago, which is that each session I find out who my students are, what they're interested in, what they want to learn about, what their favorite topics are, and then I line up interview guests and workshops and seminars and projects for Power Your Story podcast based upon the students that I have in that session. And that is how the VIP circle is going to work. I want to find out who's in my circle and what you need, what you're interested in, what you want to learn about. And then I will find masterclasses, guest speakers, and projects that we can work on together to grow in the direction that you want to grow. So you have a lot of control in that circle, and I am here as a guide and a resource for you. Again, those URLs, of course, are in the show notes for this episode, thecreativeimposter.com/launchpodenvy and thecreativeimposter.com/grow together. Get the details soon. Soon. It's already almost holiday time. Both programs start in January of 2019, so be sure you get on the list to get the full scoop by December 1st. I'd love to have you. And now it sounds very doom and gloom, right? It sounds very like heavy topics and using podcasting to fight against darkness. But one thing that I love about your approach is that you do come from a place of optimism, I feel, when I listen to your show. And you do find ways to bring in joy as well. And it's not all heavy and overwhelming. So do you consciously think about how you balance out these very difficult and heavy topics with sort of the lighter side and infusing optimism into the conversations that you're bringing forth?
Yes. So certainly when I'm on my podcast itself, as I'm bringing episodes out, I think there really is an interesting balance of different kinds of people and topics. And it really follows where I am and what I'm needing. And so sometimes I need to focus on something like a morning practice.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I will definitely be drawing on that Friday morning before I sit down to interview Sabrina, having had that space for myself. I'm about to release an episode tomorrow with a mindfulness parenting expert who also has a podcast. Her name's Michelle Gale. And we were also talking about, listening to yourself and what you need. And I was telling her that I was visiting my father who just had bypass heart surgery. And my mom was going to see Black Klansman. And I was just really feeling heavy. And even though that's a movie that I have since seen and is, resonates with a lot of the things I care about, on that particular day, I needed to just go see Crazy Rich Asians. And that's what I did. So, I think listening to yourself, filling the podcast, filling my life, filling my day with a balance of different kinds of experiences and giving me what I need is really essential for sustaining ourselves. And then the other thing is that life is multi-layered. And even when I'm having a conversation, like the one maybe that I mentioned with Sarah Mercuria of Mothers Against Police Brutality, I'm really talking with her about her life and the fullness of all the things that she's experienced, but also all the things that she's learned and what she's grateful for. I think there's a lot of focus on acknowledgement in the conversations that I have about what these different experiences in our life has brought to us and what we're doing with it. So I appreciate that you experience that as you listen. It is definitely a value of mine.
Okay, shifting gears a little bit, I want to get talking about podcasting. One of the things that I personally like to take advantage of from having other podcasters on the show is finding out how other people are doing things and what other resources people are drawing on, because this helps me as a podcast coach. And I also think it helps the listeners to get ideas about how to craft their show in certain ways or how to think about podcasting. So, first question, how did you come up with the title for your show, Mother's Quest?
So the title, it's the name of the overarching umbrella of everything I do. I know that you are also mentored by Elsie Escobar, and she talks a lot about your podcast ecosystem.
Yeah.
Mother's Quest is the name for the whole community and ecosystem, the coaching programs that I do, my blog, my Facebook group, and the podcast. So that name was really with me, I would say, throughout my whole motherhood journey. For many years, I just kept thinking I'm on a quest as a mother, and that name was just with me. It was the name of the first workshop I ever did with mothers, and it wasn't something I had to belabor at all. It was just something I knew.
What about the cover art? I love your cover art. Where did that come from?
So the cover art, it includes the burst, which is part of my logo, which again is used for all of the components of Mother's Quest. And I like to talk a lot about spark moments. So those moments in our lives where we see something in a new way or we feel inspired to set out on a new path or make a change in our lives. Like I mentioned that the day of the Charlottesville rally, hearing about that was a spark moment for me in creating Women Podcasters in Solidarity. Well, I had a spark moment for finally saying yes to creating Mother's Quest. And we can share the link to my introductory episode because I tell the whole story in detail. But in a nutshell, it was a day that I had been feeling frustrated, that I wasn't moving forward with this vision I had. And I was reminded that it was a year since the launch of this workshop that I had done. And I had done nothing since. And I felt really trapped. And then I walked into my house and was hearing this crashing noise. And it turned out that there were two birds trapped in my house. And the whole interesting experience of what happened with those two birds and how I let them out and the symbolism they came to mean for me was really my spark moment for creating everything. And so the burst, if you look closely, if you know to look for it, you'll see that there are also two birds that come out of the burst, representing what that spark moment was for me.
That's probably the best cover art story I've ever heard on the show. What about your theme music and also your intro? You have someone in your intro as well.
Yes. One of my values and also gifts is that I'm very intentional about everything I do. There's a lot of thought that goes into everything. So when I went to create my intro, which Carly Nemo of Radcasters was instrumental in helping me with, I really wanted mothers to be involved in every aspect of what I was creating. So I hired a friend who's a mom who does this program called Launch Sessions to do all my branding. So they helped me come up with the birds. I wanted the music to come from a female musician who was a mom. And so I reached out to Pond 5 in their curating department and asked them if any of their contributors, if they knew if any of them were mothers. And I got connected to a composer who lived in Great Britain. And I actually emailed her and told her about the premise of my show and the kind of feel I was looking for. And she actually sent me some pieces that she created that she thought would be good for it. And I was able to choose from there. And then I also wanted my opening to have some personality and to connect to my children in some way and to the journey I've been on about trying to hold these two things as possible, both having children in my life and that being a reality of my day, but also wanting to create something meaningful. So my children are in the opening, and that dance of, sort of being interrupted and coming back to what you're trying to create is illustrated in that.
What's your biggest strength as a podcaster?
Well, I've been really appreciating, especially in the last 2 episodes, we end every episode with acknowledgments. So I acknowledge and thank my guests for whatever I'm taking away from the conversation. And then I give them an opportunity to do that. It just so happens these last 2 times, my guests have been so generous and lovely in reflecting back their experience of being on the podcast. And they've both said in different ways that they felt that time they spent with me was very nourishing to them, that they had been interviewed by many people many times, but that this really felt like a conversation and that they were leaving with a lot more awareness and clarity and feeling connected and inspired to their own selves and their lives. And that's really what I aspire to do in every conversation, to make sure that that time is, not only for me and not only for the people listening, but that it can really leave the people who I'm interviewing feeling enriched by the experience. So I would say it's that thoughtfulness. And then I'm a coach, so I 100% use my coaching skills as I'm interviewing all the time. The ability to listen deeply at multiple levels, to reflect back what I'm hearing, to ask empowering, open-ended questions. And I really explore my curiosity when I ask questions, but not just curiosity to satisfy my own interests, but curiosity from an intuitive place that I think is really going to help shed some light for the person who I'm talking to about their life.
Is there anything that you dislike about podcasting?
Yes. Absolutely. Well, I would say I'm sheltered from some of what I dislike because from the very beginning, I knew I wouldn't be able to do it if I didn't have help with all the pieces that don't come naturally to me. So from the very start, I had somebody get my whole, podcast set up. And for me, that was Carly at Radcasters. And then I've had my VA, Bridget, and her husband, Nico, are my podcasting team. And they get the episodes up, and Bridget does all my podcast art, and Nico does all the sound editing. So I can really focus on the pieces that I think I am best at, which is figuring out who are the best guides to bring on, having really meaningful, thoughtful conversations. I do personally, after getting an initial draft, write all of my show notes, which are pretty lengthy and become my introduction. I almost feel like they're personal essays, and it's really how I integrate what it is I'm learning and taking away from that conversation. And then I do a lot of the outreach and sharing about the episodes. But the technical things, I don't like at all. And I do still, even though I like writing up these reflections on what I'm taking away and recording my introductions, in some ways, I do also experience a lot of resistance every time.
I definitely can relate to that. If you were to look into your crystal ball and see the future of podcasting, we're definitely in sort of a place where it's growing in popularity, both in the number of people making podcasts and becoming podcasters, and also in the total number of people figuring out what a podcast is, how on earth you listen to it, and the value of listening to podcasts. What do you see as the future potential of podcasting?
That's a great question. What I'm noticing about media in general, I mean, I very rarely turn my television on anymore. I think that we get so much of what we're looking for at our fingertips on our phones or iPads or laptops. And that is one of the amazing things about a podcast is you can access amazing content on anything you're interested in. So I think it's going to continue in that direction of us just having tremendous access. And, as you mentioned, so many people have discovered this about podcasting in particular, but there are still so many people who haven't. So I think it's going to continue down this path of more and more people being able to contribute, more and more subjects and conversations and really amazing content being offered, but hopefully more and more people having easier access and understanding how to get it.
I have two last questions for you, but before I do that, what are your favorite ways to connect with people on social media? If they want to see your beautiful cover art, if they want to interact with you, what are your favorite platforms?
So I spend a lot of time on Facebook. That's where I hang out the most. There's a Mother's Quest business page. I mentioned I have a Mother's Quest private Facebook group. That's really where I would say the most intimate connection and relationship building happens. People can go to mothersquest.com/community to put in a request to join that group. And my personal profile, I also share a lot because my life and the podcast and Mother's Quest are so intertwined. I also do share a lot there. And then I've just started getting acquainted with Instagram, which I still feel like I don't know how to use. I don't really know what I'm doing over there, but you can find me there at Mother's Quest Pod. And, you can always email me too, julie@mothersquest.com. I make an effort to respond to whoever reaches out to me.
Fantastic. And of course, it goes without saying that links to all of these things will be in the show notes for this episode. So what is your best advice for a podcaster who wants to use the platform to make a positive impact?
My best advice about that would be to follow your own, as I have, your own desire to learn more. I interviewed Nicole Lee last season as well for the Women Podcasters and Solidarity Initiative in an episode called Courageous Conversations about Race. One of the gifts she gave me was to really hold a growth mindset for these kind of conversations, to realize that we don't have to have it all figured out. There is no saying everything perfectly. And that, the best way to learn and grow is to make mistakes. So I would just encourage people to think about, what are the issues that you care about? What are you feeling like you want to learn more about? How can you be in authentic, vulnerable, real learning mode conversations with some people who are the guides you think you might like to learn from, and use your podcast as a way to have that really intimate, honest conversation. And that if it moves you, and if you find yourself learning in the process and feeling moved to action, to trust also that somebody listening to that is going to be moved as well.
Do you have any specific advice for mama podcasters or aspiring mama podcasters? Besides, find somewhere for your kids to go while you're recording so they don't interrupt you.
Yeah. I think my advice for mama podcasters may be true for lots of podcasters, which is to find a way to make it work for you and your family. So my first season, I was releasing episodes weekly, and I felt like it was really stopping me from being able to be as fully engaged in my children's lives and also attending to other things that mattered to me. And so I started going to every other week. I also personally record in seasons, and then I design the seasons around what's happening in my life and my children's life. So I had a season end just in time to really focus on my son's bar mitzvah. And I gave myself that space to be fully present for that experience with him. And over the summer, while I didn't take an official break from the podcast, I chose to re-release with some new introductions, a series of really timely and important episodes so that I could be more present as I was getting my children ready for these big school milestones. So I think make it work for you. It is helpful to be consistent and to communicate what you're doing, but to not feel like you have to follow somebody else's formula. And the other thing I would say is where and how it makes sense to involve your children in the process so that it doesn't feel necessarily like you're taking away from your experience with your family, but it really becomes something that is enriching your family. So I interviewed my older son, Ryan, for the podcast. And that's one of my favorite episodes of all time. And I know it had a huge impact on him. I've also taken, for instance, my younger son, I interviewed Kate Schatz, who's the author of the Rad Women and Rad Girls series. And she had a book signing in San Francisco. And so I brought my little guy, my 6-year-old, and he got to hear some young girls who are leaders come and speak. They're highlighted in the book, and got to meet the author and have the book signed. And we read from that book together, and now he knows the author. So I would look for lots of ways to just connect to your family in meaningful ways.
Julie, is there anything else that you want to share with our podcast Envy listeners before we say goodbye?
Well, I would like to invite your listeners, if they're interested in using their platform to have some of these conversations around social justice, and particularly this season around gun safety, which there are a number of related issues that connect to that. So I think people can kind of take that topic and make it their own in different ways. I would love for them to join the Women Podcasters and Solidarity Initiative Facebook group, where we have most of our communication happening. Commit to an episode. The other thing they can commit to is using their platform and their community to help raise funds for related causes, and definitely to talk about the importance of voting right now. But I would love to have some of your community join us in that effort.
Podcast Envy is produced by your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder. That's me. The Podcast Envy theme music is by Valentin Sosnitsky, courtesy of the Free Sound Project at freesound.org, and our podcast Angel music is by Benjamin Mastropolito, also on freesound.org as Lemon Cream. All music is licensed under the Creative Commons. Our episodes are mixed by Edwin Ruiz, and hey, if you want your show to sound as good as ours, hire us. Put the magic audio mojo of the Creative Imposter Studios to work for you. Thanks so much for listening, and here's to making your podcast the envy of everyone else.